The human aid ship, a beacon of hope. The vastness of space stretched endlessly, silent and dark, as the massive aid ship Solace One drifted toward the war-torn sector of the galaxy. It was a beacon of hope, a floating sanctuary that carried medicine, food, and relief for those suffering in the wake of destruction. Dr. Elias Carter stood on the command deck, gazing at the holographic map. He was a seasoned humanitarian, a man who had spent years tending to the wounded across countless battlefields. The galactic war between the Vrax Dominion and the Zirian Alliance had left entire planets in ruins. Billions had lost their homes, but Solace One had come to help, not to fight. The ship itself was massive, nearly the size of a battleship, but it carried no weapons. Its hull was lined with white markings, the universal symbol of peace and aid. According to galactic law, attacking a humanitarian ship was a war crime, something no sane faction would risk. The bridge was quiet except for the soft hum of the ship's systems. The crew, a mix of humans and alien volunteers, worked tirelessly, preparing for the upcoming rescue mission. "How long until we reach the Zirian colony?" Dr. Carter asked. 15 minutes, sir," replied Lieutenant Harris, a young officer monitoring the navigation systems. Carter nodded. "Good. Prepare the med teams. We don't know what conditions we'll be facing down there." His words carried weight. He had seen the horrors of war, the burned cities, the desperate refugees, the shattered lives. Yet, no matter how many times he witnessed it, it never got easier. Just as he was about to leave the bridge, an alarm blared across the ship. The lights flickered red, and a warning flashed on the main display. Unidentified vessels detected. Multiple warships approaching fast. A heavy silence fell over the bridge. Carter's eyes narrowed. Who are they? Lieutenant Harris' fingers danced over the control panel, scanning the incoming ships. Her face paled. It's the Vrax Dominion," she whispered. A cold chill ran through the crew. The Vrax Dominion were known for their brutality. They were a race of warlords, conquerors who ruled through terror. But why were they here? They had already crushed the Zirian forces. What more did they want? The main screen flickered, and suddenly, the holographic image of a Vrax warlord appeared. His reptilian face was scared, his glowing red eyes filled with malice. He wore heavy armor, adorned with the skulls of defeated enemies. "This is War General Kazak of the Vrax Dominion," the alien growled. His voice was deep, filled with contempt. "You are trespassing in Vrax territory. Surrender your ship or be destroyed." Carter clenched his fists. His voice remained calm, but firm. "This is a humanitarian vessel. We are carrying medical supplies and refugees. We are not armed, and we pose no threat to you." The Vrax warlord let out a low chuckle. "Your laws mean nothing to me, human. Your ship is large and valuable. Surrender now, or we will take it by force." Carter's jaw tightened. He knew the Vrax weren't bluffing. These warlords saw mercy as weakness. They didn't care about rules. They only cared about power. The crew looked at Carter, waiting for his command. Some of them were terrified. Others were angry. Lieutenant Harris leaned closer. "Sir, what do we do?" Carter exhaled slowly, thinking fast. There was no escape. The Vrax ships had them surrounded. Running was not an option. "We send them a final warning," Carter said. His voice was cold, determined. He turned back to the Vrax general. His eyes burned with an intensity that made even the warlord hesitate. "You attack this ship," Carter said, his tone like steel, "and you invoke the wrath of Terra." The bridge was silent. The crew held their breath. Even the Vrax general seemed surprised by Carter's fearless response. Then Kazak laughed, a deep, cruel laugh. "Terra, your people are known for their soft hearts. You believe in helping the weak. You think your kindness makes you strong." He leaned closer to the screen, his sharp teeth visible. "No, human. Mercy is weakness. And today, you will learn that." The transmission cut off. A new alarm sounded. "Sir, A crew member shouted. "They're charging their weapons." Carter took a deep breath, his mind racing. The Vraks had made their decision. They had just declared war on the wrong people. The Deathworlder's warning. The Bridge of Solace One was silent except for the steady hum of the ship's systems. Everyone stood frozen, waiting, listening. A heavy tension filled the air. The Vraks' dominion had made its choice. Dr. Elias Carter turned slowly, scanning the faces of his crew. Fear was evident in their eyes, but beneath it, there was something else. A quiet determination, a fire that refused to die. Lieutenant Harris swallowed hard, breaking the silence. "Sir, their weapons are online. They're locking onto us." Carter didn't react immediately. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. Then he turned toward the communications officer. "Send a message," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. The officer hesitated. "To whom, sir?" Carter's gaze didn't waver. "To the Vraks commander. One last time." A few keystrokes, and the channel reopened. The Vraks warlord's face flickered back onto the screen, his sharp-toothed grin filled with amusement. "I thought we were done talking, human," Kazakh sneered. Carter stepped forward, his expression devoid of fear. "This is your final warning," he said, his voice a low, measured growl. "Solace One is a humanitarian vessel, protected under intergalactic law. If you fire on this ship, you are not just attacking a crew of medics. You are declaring war on Terra." The Vraks general laughed. "War? With you? Don't make me laugh. Your people are weak, too busy tending to the wounded to understand real power." His reptilian eyes narrowed. "But I will enjoy watching you beg." Carter's expression didn't change. He stared at the warlord with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a Deathworlder. "No, General Kazakh," he said. "You don't understand. Mercy ends here." For a moment, there was silence. Kazakh's smug grin faltered. Something about the way Carter spoke, so absolute, so final, sent a strange, instinctual fear through him. Then the transmission cut off. A fresh alarm blared across the bridge. "They've locked weapons," Lieutenant Harris shouted. "They're preparing to fire." Carter's eyes darkened. "Raise countermeasures. Prepare for impact." The first shot. The first plasma bolt struck the hull of Solace One with a thunderous impact. The ship shuddered violently, metal groaning under the force of the attack. Lights flickered, alarms screamed, and several crew members stumbled as the artificial gravity briefly fluctuated. "Shields down to 72%. One of the engineers called out, his voice barely masking his panic. Another blast followed. The bridge rumbled as consoles sparked and flickered. Carter remained perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back. "Damage report." "No hull breach yet," a technician responded. "But at this rate, our shields won't last long." Carter nodded. He had expected this. The Vraks didn't just want to destroy them. They wanted to watch them suffer first. A small whimper from the back of the bridge caught his attention. He turned to see a young alien refugee, a small fox-like child from the Zirian species, clutching a medical officer's uniform, her large golden eyes filled with terror. Carter's jaw tightened. His gaze swept over the bridge crew. Fear was natural, but fear had no place here. "Lieutenant," Carter said, his voice cutting through the chaos like steel. "Prepare the beacon. Send the distress signal to Terra." Lieutenant Harris hesitated. "Sir, the Vraks will jam the transmission before it reaches." "Send it anyway." Harris obeyed, hands flying across the controls. Within moments, a pulse burst from the ship, an encrypted distress signal racing toward human space. It was a long shot, but Carter knew one thing. If Terra heard their call, the Vraks would regret everything. The Deathworlder revealed. A third impact slammed into the ship, sending another tremor through the decks. The shield generators were struggling, barely keeping up. Kazakh's voice boomed over the comms, dripping with satisfaction. "I expected more from the so-called Deathworlders," the Vraks general mocked. Where is your fight? Where is your strength? Carter exhaled slowly, stepping forward toward the screen. When he spoke, his voice was calm, cold, and utterly terrifying. You think because we heal, we are weak. His gaze locked onto Kazak's, unblinking. You think because we show mercy, we do not understand war. Kazak's grin remained, but something flickered in his expression. Carter continued, Do you know what it means to be from a death world, General? Silence. Carter leaned closer, his eyes like ice. It means we do not fear death. His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper, but we know how to bring it. Kazak's smirk faltered. Carter straightened, turning to his crew. Initiate countermeasures. Now. The trap is sprung. The Vraks expected an easy kill. What they didn't expect was that Solace One, though unarmed, was not defenseless. The ship suddenly shifted course, veering toward a dense asteroid field directly behind them. The Vraks warships pursued, but as soon as they entered the debris zone, the real fight began. Deploy the static field, Carter commanded. A pulse exploded outward from Solace One, sending a wave of electromagnetic interference across the battlefield. The Vraks sensors flickered, and several of their ships stumbled off course. Then Carter gave the next order. Release the drones. From hidden compartments within the aid ship, hundreds of autonomous repair drones swarmed outward, not to repair, but to attach to enemy hulls. Within moments, Vrak systems malfunctioned, weapons disabled, engines shutting down. It was not an attack. It was surgical precision, disabling their capacity to fight. On the Vrak's command ship, Kazak's expression twisted in rage. They're crippling our fleet. How? This was an aid ship. A single, final transmission came from Solace One. Dr. Carter's voice, calm, unyielding, and utterly merciless. You had a choice, General. You could have left us alone. A pause. But you made a mistake. A long silence. Carter's next words sent a shiver down every Vrak soldier's spine. Now, you faced the wrath of a Deathworlder. You chose war. Now face it. The battlefield was a chaotic mess of drifting ships, crackling energy fields, and wreckage tumbling through space. The once pristine void had turned into a graveyard of Vrak's arrogance. The Vrak's warships, once confident in their easy victory, were now in disarray. Their targeting systems flickered, their shields sputtered, and half their fleet was struggling to move. The repair drones that Solace One had deployed were designed for aid missions, but Carter's crew had reprogrammed them in seconds to disrupt enemy systems instead of fixing them. On the bridge of Solace One, Carter stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the tactical display. The Vraks had underestimated them. That was their first mistake. The second mistake. They gave humans a reason to fight. The Vraks' realization. On the Vraks' flagship, General Kazak seethed in frustration. His scaled fists clenched as his crew scrambled to regain control of their ship. Every time they tried to fire, their own targeting systems glitched. Every time they attempted to retreat, their navigation locks froze. This is impossible, growled one of his officers. They are a medical ship. They should not be able to do this. Kazak slammed his fist against the control panel, his slitted eyes burning with rage. They are not warriors, he spat. They are engineers. A sudden wave of dread washed over the bridge crew. That was the true danger of humans. They weren't just fighters. They adapted. They changed. They turned weaknesses into strengths, problems into solutions. And now, a single unarmed aid ship had just crippled a Vrak's battle fleet. Kazak's claws dug into the metal railing. Enough of this. Wipe them out. The killing blow, or so they thought. Aboard Solace One, alarms blared as the Vrak's fleet repositioned. They had finally stopped underestimating the humans. Now they focused their remaining firepower. They're powering up all weapons, shouted Lieutenant Harris. They're going to unleash everything they have. Carter didn't flinch. He had expected this. The Vraks were brutal, but predictable. If they couldn't win with precision, they would try to overwhelm. "Brace for impact," he ordered. The Vrak ships fired simultaneously. A storm of plasma, kinetic rounds, and missile barrages roared toward Solace One. Too much to evade. Too much to stop. For a second, it seemed like it was over. But then, the shields flickered and then stabilized. The bridge crew stared in shock as the attacks were absorbed by a golden glow spreading over the hull. "Shields, holding?" Harris gasped. Carter allowed himself a small smile. "You think a Deathworlder comes into battle unprepared," he murmured. The Vraks didn't realize that Solace One had something no other ship had. The experimental barrier, a gift from Earth's military. The Horizon-class defensive barrier was a last-resort energy shield developed for Earth's deep space warships. It absorbed kinetic and energy damage, redistributing power in real time. Solace One had been given a prototype version, designed for medical ships to withstand planetary disasters, or unexpected combat situations like this one. The Vrak's weapons were powerful, but they were too focused on brute force. They didn't realize that with every hit, the barrier redirected energy into the ship's power grid, and Carter had just enough stored power for what came next. The counterattack. Carter gripped the console. "Activate repulsor surge." A shockwave of raw energy erupted from Solace One, rippling through space. It wasn't a weapon, but it didn't need to be. The pulse overloaded the already crippled Vrak systems, frying their remaining targeting computers and engines. One by one, their ships went dark. The once proud Vrak's fleet was now drifting, powerless, silent, and Solace One was still standing. The humans had survived. Kazak's last gamble, boarding the aid ship. On the Vrak's flagship, Kazak's rage turned into pure desperation. "They refuse to die," he hissed. "Fine, if we cannot destroy them from the outside, we take them from within." Moments later, dozens of Vrak's boarding pods launched, cutting through space and slamming into Solace One's hull. The metal groaned as the invaders breached the ship. Carter's eyes darkened. They weren't going to stop. Fine. The Vraks wanted to see the true nature of Deathworlders. They were about to get a lesson in terror. The battle inside the ship. The Vraks warriors stormed into the corridors, expecting panicked, defenseless medical personnel. Instead, they were met with a trap. Humans weren't just doctors. They were survivors. The lights flickered, then cut off completely. The corridors plunged into total darkness. And that's when the screaming started. The Vrak's commandos never saw the humans coming. The crew had turned the entire ship into a battlefield, using knowledge of the layout to lure enemies into choke points. Some sealed entire decks and vented oxygen, suffocating the Vraks inside. Others rewired maintenance drones to ambush the invaders. Medics, armed with scalpels and emergency tools, fought with surgical precision. Even the refugees, terrified but determined, threw themselves into the fight. And Carter, he was leading the charge. A Vrak's warrior lunged at him, a plasma blade in hand. Carter sidestepped with effortless speed, grabbed the warrior's arm, and in one brutal motion, snapped it at the elbow. The alien screamed, but Carter was already moving, grabbing a scalpel from his belt and driving it straight through the warrior's throat. Mercy was gone. This was survival. The final standoff. Kazak stumbled onto the bridge, covered in wounds, his breathing ragged. His soldiers were dead, his fleet was crippled, and the humans had won. Carter stood in front of him, calm, unshaken. His uniform was blood-stained, but his blue eyes burned like fire. Kazak panted, his reptilian chest heaving. You're no healer." Carter's gaze was cold. "I'm a human." He stepped forward, voice like steel. "And you made a mistake." A heavy silence. Carter raised his hand. "Take him alive. Let Terra deal with him." Kazak screamed in rage as human soldiers restrained him. The Vrak's dominion had just learned the most important lesson of their existence. You can attack an army. You can attack a fleet. But you never, ever attack a Deathworlder's aid ship. The hunters become the hunted. The once mighty Vrax fleet floated dead in space, its warships powerless, its warriors either captured or scattered in terror. The battlefield that had once promised an easy victory had instead turned into a massacre of their own making. Inside Solace One, the battle for survival had ended. And now, it was time for judgment. Kasich in chains. General Kasich knelt in the dimly lit interrogation chamber, his clawed hands bound by human restraints. His once imposing armor was cracked, his face bruised, and his arrogance shattered. He had never lost before. Not like this. Not to a medical ship. Not to humans. Across from him, Dr. Elias Carter stood, arms crossed. His face was unreadable, but his icy blue eyes bore into Kasich like twin daggers. Kasich exhaled, his pride wounded beyond repair. "I do not understand." His voice was a mix of exhaustion and resentment. "You are a healer. How? How did you do this?" Carter didn't blink. "Because you made the same mistake every warlord makes." He leaned forward, his voice quiet but deadly. "You thought we were weak." Silence. Kasich's jaw tightened. He wanted to deny it, to claim he had simply been outnumbered or outmaneuvered, but he couldn't. He had been wrong. Horribly, fatally wrong. "You don't understand humans," Carter continued. "You think because we show mercy, because we help the wounded, that we are harmless." He exhaled, shaking his head. "You never realized the truth." Kasich's slit eyes flickered. "And what truth is that?" Carter's next words sent a chill through the defeated warlord's bones. "Mercy is a choice, and today we chose to end it." Kasich's throat dried. The cold, absolute certainty in Carter's voice was unlike anything he had ever encountered. This was no battle-crazed warrior, no reckless brute. This was something worse. This was a Deathworlder who had been forced to fight. And Kasich finally understood what that meant. A message to the galaxy. On Solace One's bridge, Lieutenant Harris finished sending a secured transmission to Terra. A holographic admiral appeared, a grim-faced woman with silver hair and a hardened expression. Admiral Sarah Reynolds of the Terran Defense Fleet. Harris saluted. "Admiral, we have engaged and defeated a Vrax fleet. We are requesting immediate reinforcement and retrieval." Admiral Reynolds frowned. "A Vrax fleet? You're a medical ship, Lieutenant." "Yes, Mom." Harris swallowed. "And yet, they attacked us. We were forced to defend ourselves." Reynolds glanced at the battle logs, her expression turning into icy steel. "Understood." Her tone was clipped, but behind it was rage. The entire Terran military had one golden rule. No one attacks a humanitarian mission, not without consequences. And the Vrax Dominion had just broken that rule in the worst way possible. Reynolds straightened. "Hold position. A response fleet is already on its way." Harris nodded. "Yes, Mom." The transmission ended, but everyone on the bridge felt it. The shift in the air, the looming storm of vengeance approaching. The Terran fleet was coming, and when it arrived, there would be no survivors for the Vrax. The survivors' horror. On the wreckage of a damaged Vrax warship, a handful of survivors clung to what remained of their fleet. Their leader, Captain Zilkar, had barely escaped Solace One before it was overrun. He and 20 warriors had fled, believing they had escaped the worst of it. But then they heard the transmission. They heard the human admiral's voice, and for the first time, they felt a different kind of fear, not of death, but of what was coming. One of the warriors, his scales dull from exhaustion, whispered, "They won't just kill us, will they?" Zilkar didn't answer, because he knew the truth. The humans wouldn't just kill them. They would make an example of them. To warn the galaxy. To ensure that no one ever made this mistake again. The judgment of Terra. 3 hours later, the stars themselves burned. The first human warship appeared on long-range scanners, then 10 more, then 100. The Terran Defense Fleet had arrived. Not just to retrieve Solace One, but to avenge it. General Kasich, still restrained, watched in growing horror from the window of his holding cell as the entire horizon filled with warships. He had fought wars for decades, had led planetary invasions, had conquered entire civilizations. But he had never seen anything like this. This wasn't a battle fleet. This was an execution force. And the Vrax Dominion was about to learn what it meant to provoke Deathworlders. Final warning to the galaxy. As the first Terran warship hailed the Vrax remnants, a single message was broadcast across the galaxy. It was Carter's voice. Calm. Cold. Final. This is Dr. Elias Carter of the Terran Medical Corps. We came to heal. You made us fight. Let this be the last time anyone makes that mistake. The message ended, and the bombardment began. Humanity's reinforcements arrive. The vast silence of space was broken by the roar of war engines as the Terran Defense Fleet arrived. The Vrax survivors, already crippled, could do nothing but watch in horror as hundreds of human warships emerged from hyperspace, surrounding them like wolves circling dying prey. On board Solace One, Dr. Elias Carter stood on the bridge, watching the tactical display. The human fleet had arrived exactly when expected, because that's how humans worked. They were never late to war. Lieutenant Harris stared at the display, her voice almost a whisper. They sent the Wrathborn. Carter's grip on the railing tightened. The HSS Wrathborn. It wasn't just a warship, it was a legend. A Terran super-dreadnought, built for planetary sieges, equipped with enough firepower to turn entire fleets into space dust. It was the kind of ship that didn't just arrive for a normal battle. It arrived for annihilation. Aboard the Wrathborn, Admiral Sarah Reynolds stood on her own bridge, her silver hair pulled back into a tight knot, her face unreadable. She watched the battlefield. The crippled Vrax warships, the floating wreckage, and the unarmed humanitarian vessel that had somehow survived an entire fleet attack. Her expression didn't change, but her wrath burned brighter than the ship's cannons. She opened a channel, broadcasting to every remaining Vrax ship. Her voice was cold, sharp, and absolute. This is Admiral Reynolds of the Terran Defense Fleet. You have attacked a humanitarian vessel. You have committed an act of war against the Terran people. There will be no negotiations. There will be no mercy. Her eyes narrowed. You have exactly 1 minute to surrender. After that, we wipe you from existence. The transmission cut off. The countdown began. The Vrax's desperation. On the bridge of the crippled Vrax flagship, Captain Zilkar was sweating. His entire body trembled as he looked at the fleet of death surrounding them. "This is madness," one of his officers whispered. "We were not prepared for this. We thought." "You thought they would be weak," Zilkar snarled. "You thought humans would roll over and die." He turned toward the main view screen, where the Wrathborn loomed like a god of war, its weapon systems already charging. Zilkar swallowed hard. "We surrender," he said. His voice was hoarse, broken. "Send the message. Now." One of his officers hesitated. "Captain, Kasich is still captured on their ship. If we surrender, they will. They will kill us all if we don't," Zilkar snapped. "Send the damn message." Too late for mercy. On the Wrathborn's bridge, the Vrax surrender message came through. Admiral Reynolds glanced at it, then turned to her tactical officer. "Have they powered down their weapons?" she asked. The officer checked. A pause. Then he shook his head. "No, ma'am. Their primary batteries are still online." Reynolds smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "They're trying to buy time," she said. She tapped the console, reopening the channel to the Vrax fleet. "Surrender means powering down your weapons. You have 10 seconds. There was a flicker of hesitation from the Vrax ships. Some of them began to lower their weapons, but others turned their remaining guns toward the Wrathborn. That was it. Reynolds nodded. Fire. The Wrath of Terra. The Wrathborn's main railguns fired first. Hyper-accelerated slugs the size of small buildings tore through the first Vrax ship before its crew even realized what was happening. The kinetic impact alone shattered their shields, then ripped the vessel in half. Within seconds, the other Terran warships followed. Torpedoes screamed through the void, striking deep into Vrax hulls and detonating their cores. Plasma cannons ignited the remains, turning ships into molten wreckage. Point defense lasers vaporized any escape pods trying to flee. There was no battle. It was extermination. On board Solace One, Carter watched the destruction unfold, his expression unreadable. His crew remained silent. No one cheered. This was not victory. This was punishment. The Vrax Dominion had broken the laws of war. Now the Terran Defense Fleet was erasing them from history. Kazik's last moment. Inside his cell, General Kazik could hear the sounds of war. The muffled explosions, the roar of ship reactors melting down, the dying screams of his people over the radio. For the first time in his life, he felt true fear. The cell door hissed open. Kazik looked up. Dr. Carter stood there, flanked by 2 Terran Marines. The human doctor gazed at him with no anger, no hatred, only a quiet, unshakable certainty. Kazik licked his cracked lips. You cannot wipe out my people over this. My empire is vast. There will be consequences. Carter tilted his head slightly. You still don't get it, do you? He said softly. Kazik scowled. Get what? Carter took 1 step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. You are not at war with an empire. You are at war with Deathworlders. Kazik's blood ran cold. Carter turned to the Marines. Execute him. Before Kazik could even process what was happening, the Marines raised their rifles. 1 shot. Then silence. Kazik was no more. The aftermath. A message to the galaxy. Days later, word spread across the galaxy. The Vrax Dominion had ceased to exist. Their fleets were obliterated. Their leaders were dead. And the Terran message was clear. We are healers. We are protectors. But if you strike us down, we will rise. We will fight. And we will erase you. The legacy of Solace One. Months later, Solace One was fully repaired, its mission unchanged. It continued its journey across war-torn sectors, offering aid, food, and healing. But now, whenever it arrived, the warlords and pirates fled before it. Because they knew the truth. You can attack a battle fleet. You can attack a warrior race. But you never, ever attack a Deathworlder's aid ship. The wrath of a Deathworlder. The galaxy watched in silence. Where once the Vrax Dominion had stood as a proud and feared empire, now there was only debris, ruin, and silence. The Terran Defense Fleet had delivered judgment, and the lesson was final. No one attacks a humanitarian mission and lives. And yet, deep within the shattered remains of the Vrax fleet, in the drifting wreckage of what had once been a mighty armada, there were still survivors. Survivors who now understood terror in a way they never had before. The last of the Vrax. A broken fleet. Aboard the remaining Vrax warships, those who had fled, those who had barely escaped the firestorm of Terra's wrath. A grim silence hung over the decks. The warriors who had once laughed at the weak, who had boasted of their conquests, now sat in quiet, hollow fear. Captain Zilkar, the highest-ranking Vrax officer still alive, stared at the war reports, his talons trembling. He read the damage assessments, the casualty lists, the cold numbers that spelled the end of his people. His fleet was gone. His generals were dead. His homeworld was defenseless. And worst of all, the Terrans hadn't even come for their capital yet. They were waiting, letting the horror settle in. Because that was how humans fought wars, not with just their weapons, but with fear itself. Zilkar swallowed, his throat dry. "This is impossible," one of his officers whispered. "They weren't supposed to be like this. We were told they were weak." Weak. The word echoed through Zilkar's mind. They had believed it. All of them had. And now, they were the ones running for their lives. Zilkar exhaled shakily. "Send a message to our homeworld," he said. "Tell them, the humans are coming." His officer hesitated. "And what should we tell them to do?" Zilkar didn't answer. Because there was no answer. The warning that came too late. The message reached Vrax Prime, the capital world of the once mighty Dominion. The high warlords sat in their towering citadel, their reptilian faces twisted in disbelief. They had never feared anyone before. Not the Zirian Alliance. Not the Galactic Council. Certainly not the humans. But now, the Wrathborn and the Terran fleet were closing in. And they understood. The Vrax were not just losing. They were about to be wiped from existence. Panic spread through the capital. The warlords screamed at each other, blaming Kasich, blaming Zilkar, blaming their own arrogance. But it was too late. The sky darkened as the first Terran warships entered orbit. A single message was broadcast from Admiral Sarah Reynolds. "Your time is over. There will be no negotiations. No surrender. You have 1 hour to evacuate. After that, we erase you." The transmission cut off. The countdown began, and for the first time in Vrax history, their warriors dropped their weapons and ran. The final attack, Carter's decision. On Solace 1, Dr. Elias Carter stood on the bridge, watching the capital planet below. Even from orbit, he could see the panic. Civilians fleeing. Ships launching from the surface, desperately trying to escape. He had seen this before, on other planets, in other wars. The innocent always suffered for the mistakes of their leaders. Carter tightened his jaw. For days, he had watched the Terran fleet unleash its fury upon the Vrax. Cities burned. Ships turned to dust. Armies wiped from history. And now, the war was ending. But at what cost? A part of him wanted vengeance. He had seen his friends die at the hands of the Vrax. He had held dying refugees in his arms. People who had begged him to save them, only for their wounds to be too deep, too fatal. He had seen too much suffering. And yet, was this the answer? Was this how humans would be remembered? Not as the defenders of peace, but as the monsters who wiped out an entire race. Carter exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Then he turned to Lieutenant Harris. "Open a channel to the fleet," he ordered. Harris hesitated, then obeyed. A moment later, Admiral Reynolds' holographic image appeared. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. But Carter could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "This better be important, Doctor," Reynolds said. Carter held her gaze. "It is," he said. "I need you to stand down." Silence. The bridge crew froze. Reynolds' gaze sharpened. "Excuse me." Carter took a deep breath. "Admiral, we won. The Vrax are finished. Their armies are gone. Their warships are gone. Their people are terrified of us." Reynolds said nothing. Carter continued, "If we destroy them now, we don't just end a war. We become something worse than they ever were." Reynolds studied him for a long moment. "You're asking me to spare them?" Carter nodded. "Not all of them. Just the ones who aren't warriors. The ones who had nothing to do with this war." A long silence stretched between them. Then Reynolds sighed, rubbing her temple. "I swear to God, Carter," she muttered, "you're going to be the reason I get court-martialed one day." Carter smiled. "Probably." Reynolds exhaled sharply. Then she turned to her fleet officers. "All ships," she ordered, "cease planetary bombardment." A wave of relief swept through the bridge crew. The war was over. And for the first time, mercy had returned. The new galactic order. Weeks later, the galaxy was forever changed. The Vrax Dominion was gone. The survivors, those who had surrendered, were allowed to rebuild under strict Terran oversight. No one dared challenge the humans now. They were no longer seen as weak. They were feared. And Solace One. It continued its mission. Dr. Elias Carter and his crew kept healing, kept saving lives, even among former Vrac citizens. Because that's what made humans different. They could be monsters if forced to be. But they chose to be more. The final warning. A new law was written across the stars. One that would be remembered forever. One that no empire dared challenge. Never attack a humanitarian vessel. Never provoke the wrath of Terra. Because mercy is a choice, and if you take it away, we will end you. And so, across the universe, one simple truth remained. You can attack a fleet. You can attack a world. But you never, ever attack a Deathworlder's aid ship. The final message, never again. The war was over, but its echoes would never fade. Across the galaxy, the destruction of the Vrac's dominion sent ripples through every empire, every federation, every warlord who had once mocked humanity. They had all believed the same lie, that humans were soft, that they were too kind, too merciful to ever be a true threat. But the lesson had been taught in fire. Humanity was not weak. They had offered peace, offered mercy, and when it was thrown back in their faces, they had burned an empire to the ground. Now, the galactic order had changed forever, and every species knew one simple rule. Never attack the Deathworlder's aid ship. The rebirth of Solace One. 3 months after the fall of the Vrac's dominion, Solace One drifted through space once more, its hull fully repaired, its mission unchanged. Despite the war, despite the bloodshed, Dr. Elias Carter and his crew had never abandoned their purpose. They were healers first, warriors only when forced. And now, they traveled to a new world, one that had once lived in terror of the Vracs, now left abandoned in the wake of war. The Zirian people had suffered the most under the Vracs, their cities burned, their people enslaved. But now they would be saved by the very ones the Vracs had tried to destroy. As the ship entered Zirian space, Carter stood on the bridge, looking at the ruined planet below. His crew waited for his orders. He took a slow breath. "Send the transmission," he said. A moment later, a message echoed across the sector, reaching every survivor below. "This is Dr. Elias Carter of the Terran Medical Corps. We come in peace. We bring aid, supplies, and medical relief. We are not here to fight. We are here to heal." A long silence. Then, a broken, static-filled reply came from the surface, a voice filled with disbelief and hope. "Are you really human?" Carter smiled. "Yes, and we never abandon those in need." The message reached every corner of the galaxy. The war had ended. The humans were victorious. But even after all they had suffered, after all they had done, they still chose to save lives. And that, more than anything, made them the most dangerous species of all. The Council's verdict: humanity on trial. Despite their victory, the Terran people were summoned before the Galactic Council, accused of genocide, war crimes, and destruction beyond reason. For the first time in history, humans were feared on a level beyond any empire. The trial was held on Neutral Station Alpha, a massive, ancient structure that had existed long before humans took to the stars. Hundreds of species gathered, watching as the leaders of Terra stood before the council, waiting for their judgment. The Zirian representative, one of the many species who had once suffered under the Vracs, stood to speak. His voice was measured, calm, but filled with fire. The humans did not start this war. The Vracs did. The humans did not seek destruction. They sought peace. And yet, when their mercy was met with violence, when their people were slaughtered, they did not ask for justice. They delivered it. Silence filled the chamber. The Terran ambassador, an old but battle-hardened man, stepped forward. His voice was unshaken, absolute. "You call us monsters because we ended a threat that had enslaved and butchered entire civilizations. You judge us, yet you stood by while the Vracs burned planets, while they executed children, while they enslaved entire species. We are not sorry for what we did. We will not apologize for defending our own. And if you think we regret teaching the galaxy a lesson, then you do not understand humans at all. The council was silent, because they knew he was right. After a long pause, the ruling was given. Humanity will not be punished, but let the lesson be clear: never provoke the wrath of Terra again. The message was broadcast across the stars. The future of the galaxy, a changed era. The galaxy would never be the same again. The Vrax dominion was no more. The Terran defense fleet was unmatched, unchallenged. The Zurian people and other liberated species now stood alongside humanity. Their greatest enemy turned into their greatest protector. And Solace won. It became a legend, a symbol of hope and warning. Whenever it arrived in a war zone, the fighting stopped immediately. Because no one, not even the most ruthless warlords, dared repeat the Vrax's mistake. The final broadcast, a warning to all. As humanity continued its mission of peace, one final broadcast was sent across the galaxy, a recording of Carter's last words to the Vrax before they fell. It was played in every corner of space, from the richest empires to the most desperate pirate outposts. A reminder, a warning. Mercy is a choice. But if you take it away, then so are you. And across the universe, warlords, criminals, and kings alike understood one thing: you can fight humans. You can challenge their fleets. You can wage wars against their colonies. But you never, ever attack a Deathworlder's aid ship. Because if you do, you won't live long enough to regret it.